Well, hi again. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. We're going to get the afternoon started. Just a reminder to the folks that are joining online: do put your questions in the platform. We're going to have time after each session for some questions of the speakers. So take advantage of that. Kind of continuing with our lineup of industry thought leaders, we asked Chris Hughes from Acquia to join us. And Chris is a Air Force veteran. He's a cyber innovation fellow with CISA. He's very active in our community, and I know a lot of you guys are very interested in software supply chain, and Chris literally wrote a book on that recently, so we had to have Chris in here to talk about that topic. So Chris, please join us. Thank you. Chris Hughes.
Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing all right. And I got to follow up Daniel Miesler and Ed, so that's a tall feat, but hopefully you'll stick with me in addition to being after lunch. As he mentioned, I'll be giving a talk on software supply chain security and vulnerability management. I have a book with a similar title, which I'll get to later on, but as he mentioned, I work as a cyber innovation fellow at CISA. Also own my own company, a consulting firm called Acquia. So let's dive right in. As I mentioned, co-founder of Acquia, also a cyber innovation fellow at CISA, an author, and pretty active in our community. I really like the talks we've had today so far. So let's dive into some of the topics here. We've heard a lot about open source software, for example. It's a bit of an eyesore, and that's intentional. This is the landscape from CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And as you look, there's a lot of things to choose from here, right? We have a robust community and ecosystem of open source software, and for good reasons. CI/CD, you can talk about pipelines, technologies, AI, like Daniel dove into. There's a lot of great technologies and some metrics here showing that organizations are overwhelmingly using open source software. They're planning to adopt more open source software, and they're planning to start to kind of sponsor some of these things and provide some compensation to the folks that are doing these projects and components, which is critical, you'll see in a moment. And we all know that this recently happened with the XZ Utilities example, for example. So there's also some negative aspects of open source software, and we actually just saw this happen with XZ Utilities, among many other examples you can see here. Log4j, you name it, the things go on. And some of the challenges here is we see that most modern software, most modern code bases is 60 to 80% of open source software. But we're also seeing that the attackers have realized rather than targeting one single organization, especially when organizations are pushing to kind of bolster their perimeter, move away from the legacy, castle moat approach to security, and moving towards zero trust, for example, it's a lot easier to have an attack where you attack one software supplier, one widely used open source software component, and have a massive downstream impact. So you can see the open source software and software supply chain attacks are on the rise in general, and many of these projects are often taken care of, as we recently saw, by literally one person or a handful of people. And the whole internet, thousands of organizations, millions of individuals are relying on these projects. But they're often uncompensated. They're doing this in their own free time, just doing it as a hobby, for example. They're not being compensated or rewarded for their activity. And incidents are sending organizations scrambling. When we look at the rise of using open source software, most organizations can't tell you, where do I have a Log4j? Where do I have an XZ Utilities? Which of my software suppliers are using these components, for example? Many organizations just simply don't have that visibility. And it's kind of ironic because we know from things like SANS or CIS, critical controls for folks who have been doing this a long time, software asset inventory is a critical control. In fact, it's like the second one on the list. Most people have no clue what they're using, where it resides in the enterprise, where they may be impacted when the next XZ Utilities or Log4j or you name it, these things keep coming. When those happen, they have no real clue where that is in their environment and how they're being impacted. So as I talked about, most modern code bases, 60 to 80% are using open source software, and in fact, that's what they're comprised of. It's mostly open source software with some glue or some proprietary software mixed in there, first-party code, things of that nature. As you see, 91% of it, essentially, from studies like Synopsys, show that it's open source software underneath the hood. And it's great, it's great that we're using it. It saves time, it saves money, it's efficient, it accelerates time. We talked about the speed to market and things that are driving the business decisions around software development. It makes a lot of sense that we're using these things, right? But the problem is the community is heavily unsupported. If you look at things like bus factor, is a term that means, how many people are contributing to this project or this component. What's its robust resiliency, for example, of contributors and maintainers. 25% of all projects in the open source software community have one developer contributing code. 94% have less than 10. So these things that are running the open, the internet, everything from consumer goods to critical infrastructure, national security systems, weapon systems, you name it, are largely being run by a small handful of people or even a single individual in many cases. And often when we look at software supply chain security or software security or AppSec in general, we're looking at lagging indicators of risk. Other known vulnerabilities, right? We go and patch CVEs, we address vulnerabilities. But the problem is that's a lagging indicator of risk. It's already vulnerable. Something's already happened. We know that there's a risk there, it can be exploited, and it gives the attackers a pathway to do something. But there's also leading indicators of risk. We have the opportunity to mature our approach to open source software and application security by looking at some of these leading indicators of risk. If you look at this diagram here, this is actually a project that started at a company named Endor Labs, and now it's part of the OWASP Foundation. It's the top open source software top 10 risks list. And you'll see things on that list like compromise of a legitimate package. Did we recently just see that happen? I think we did, and we got very lucky that we caught it in that case. It's not always going to be the situation that happens. There's also outdated software, unmaintained software. I showed you something in the previous slide here from Synopsys. They show you that almost 90% of open source software projects haven't had new development in 2 years. People just aren't keeping it up to date, and it's not their day job. They shouldn't necessarily be held to that standard. You have no service level agreement with them. They have no responsibility to you or obligation to you to maintain something that you're using. If you're using it as is. It's your responsibility. There's other things on the list here that we look at and see things like unapproved changes or over and undersized dependencies, for example. If anyone's been in cybersecurity or application security for some time, that software bloat, attack surface is a major problem. If you have, say bloated containers, that's just a lot of dependencies, a lot of components, a lot of libraries that can be compromised, and you may not even be using them. You may not even have a need for them. They're just kind of bolted in there and bundled in there in the things you're using and offer that opportunity for attackers to compromise them. Another project I wanted to call out is OpenSSF. They have a project called Scorecard that can go out and look at, I think it's like, I want to say 10,000 of the most widely used open source software projects, and it can look at some of these leading indicators of risk. How many people are contributing to it? What's the repository hygiene? What kind of configurations does the repository have to mitigate some of these software supply chain concerns that we see? So what do we do about this? How do we start to tackle this problem? We don't want to say open source software is bad. A lot of people will kind of get this false dichotomy of open source software being more or less secure than proprietary software. First, it's kind of a straw man argument because proprietary software, as I pointed out, is overwhelmingly made of open source software, for one. And two, there's some big name proprietary software vendors who have gotten wrecked recently. You can go read the Cybersecurity Safety Review Board report on one of the most notable, widely pervasive software companies in the world who are struggling terribly to do good security. So it's not that open source is any more or less secure, it's just we need to have a defense in depth approach. We need to mature our approach of how we use these things, how we use open source software. So some recommendations here I want to call out from NIST. I know NIST has been mentioned a few times, a lot of great resources from them. They make some recommendations around establishing a robust cybersecurity supply chain risk management program. I'm working with some federal agencies and some large enterprise organizations who are starting to do that now, starting to look at what software do we use, where's it coming from, who's contributing to it, who's participating in it, and understand that ecosystem. Now that we know that software supply chain attacks are on the rise and it's a big target for malicious actors, maturing our approach of how we consume and use software, whether it's proprietary or open source or SaaS or whatever the case is, just understanding who are our suppliers and what expectations do we have of them. What are they doing around secure software development practices? How mature are they? Things of that nature. There's also some organizations like Linux, the Linux Foundation, OpenSSF, who are putting out some great information that I'll touch on here soon. And then NIST itself also produced what's called 800-161, which dives into some of these software supply chain practices. What are these things we should be doing? And what are some of the capabilities we have, which I'll touch on in a moment. And they kind of put out this maturity model. You have foundational, sustaining, and enhancing capabilities. And that's because as an organization, you can't just jump from 0 to 100. It's a process, it's a journey, just like adopting AI, just like maturing your approach to zero trust. It's going to be a process. It's going to take time, resources, commitment, and effort. So they made some recommendations in there, including things like software composition analysis, understanding what we're using, software bill of materials, getting these artifacts from our vendors to understand what's in this product that you sold me. If anyone is not familiar with the term of an SBOM, think of it like an ingredient list of a software or an application, for example. We often consume food or other things. We purchase things and we understand what's in it. When it comes to software, things that are powering our entire digital infrastructure, our whole critical infrastructure, our economic prosperity, often we don't know what's in it. We just use it, it works, we depend on it, we take it for granted. Things like SBOMs can start to show you what's inside of it. And there's other artifacts called VEX, for example, Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. If you haven't heard of that, you'll see why it's important here in a moment. But that's understanding not just what the vulnerabilities are, but which ones should I actually be worried about? Ed talked a lot about Patch Tuesday and fix all the things. The problem is there's too many things to fix and not enough people to fix them. There's not enough time in the day. We can't fix all the things. So we need to prioritize what's actually exploitable, what's known to be exploited. And I'll dive into that here in a little bit as well. So I talked about the maturity model that NIST put out. They dive into some of these different capabilities you should be considering. Everything starting from a foundational approach of just looking at NIST SSDF, for folks not familiar with that. That's a secure software development framework. If you're in the federal space, you likely have heard of this. If you haven't, the federal government is actually now requiring, I think it's within the next 180 days from today and 60 days for critical software, that all software suppliers selling software to the federal government now need to self-attest that they're following NIST Secure Software Development Framework. So if you're making software, you're selling software, and you haven't started to look at how we're doing it securely, what practices do we have in place, what gaps do we have, you need to start now, especially if you sell to the federal government. And you'll see that they're trying to use their purchasing power, which is in the tens of billions a year in terms of what they purchase and what they spend, to kind of drive a systemic change across the ecosystem. And I'm sure the speaker from CISA later will probably touch on that as well. And then they move on from there to other activities like software composition analysis, starting to look for vulnerable components, and even going as far as maybe standing up an internal repository of things that we vetted, things that we feel comfortable with. We allow our developers to use these. There's a vetted process. Think like if you heard of golden images, for example. Same concept. You're maintaining something that's trusted, it's known, you have a level of assurance around its risk, and people can start to use it. People are starting to do the same thing for open source software, understanding which ones have we vetted, which ones are we comfortable with, which ones should we allow our developers to use. The challenge is there, and I'm sure many of you know this, security engineers, security practitioners are often exponentially outnumbered compared to developers, and you can't always govern what they do. So the key here, and this is something that the team here at Security Compass talks about, is empowering developers to make those decisions themselves, because they're closest to integrating these components and using these things. Another thing that we'll talk about is CI/CD pipelines. You name it, GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, and on. And there's a lot of good reasons to use these. Like it expedites our ability to deliver software. We've heard about shift security left. We can put the whole acronym soup of SAST, DAST, SCA, secret scanning, and I won't belabor the whole point, but there's many of these tools you can put into your CI/CD pipeline and start to scan. What are we producing? What are we pushing to production? Where are the vulnerabilities? How do I kind of get this report to the developers and get them to remediate this before they go to production? And we implement, often gates or guardrails, as we call them, before they can go to production with something. Here's the findings. Here's the things you need to be concerned about. But the challenge here is, and malicious actors have realized this, is if they can compromise your CI/CD pipeline, now they can compromise everything that comes through it. It's a conduit, right? If they can compromise that pipeline, we all have heard of SolarWinds, for example. If you compromise that software development process, where these pieces of artifacts and software and versions, et cetera, are coming from, you can have a massive downstream impact. SolarWinds, I think it was 18,000 organizations that were impacted. Many of those large federal organizations, Department of Defense, critical infrastructure entities, and so on. So it's a massive risk that we need to keep in mind. And many organizations haven't really adopted a cohesive or comprehensive approach to their CI/CD pipeline. They may have this tool from open source, this tool from one vendor. It's all kind of patchwork, quilted together. It's not really communicating well. We don't have all the vulnerabilities or findings coming to a united, comprehensive approach of reporting and visibility, things like that. So you need to use these pipelines to facilitate secure software development and delivery and actually safeguard not just the software that's coming through, but the underlying infrastructure, the CI/CD pipelines and the technologies you're using to kind of usher software through the pipeline as well. So malicious actors have even went as far as starting to compromise signing systems. We've heard if it's signed, it can be trusted. We have some level of assurance in that. But if they compromise the signing system, looks legitimate to me, it's signed by the software vendor, I should use it, right? It's safe, not necessarily. They're thinking ahead. So what do we do about this? There's some other great resources I wanted to call out here. It came out of Google originally, but there's one called Software or Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts, SALSA, if you've heard of that. You can check that out. There's also a CI/CD security top 10 list. We have someone in the audience here who helped create that. And you can go look and see what are some of the top 10 risks I need to be concerned about when it comes to CI/CD, when I have a CI/CD platform or technology in my environment. What are some key considerations? And you'll notice a lot of these things, obviously some are unique, but just inadequate identity and access management. Like these are common things that apply to other environments, but we need to apply it to CI/CD environments as well. So definitely give some resources from OWASP a look in terms of their OWASP top 10 for CI/CD, as well as we've talked about threat modeling a lot. Looking at it from an adversarial perspective. What are we building? What are we doing? Et cetera. Like kind of the 4 questions. Look at that. Look at your CI/CD pipeline from that perspective. How can it be compromised? How might a malicious actor, target this environment with malicious intent? And what can they do? How do we kind of bolster our defenses against that? Another thing I want to talk about is Kubernetes and containers. I'm sure if you've been in tech, the last, 5 years, you can't get away from these terms. Everyone's using Kubernetes. Everyone's, moving to containers. Everything is going cloud native. And some metrics up to here, some surveys have shown that 75% of global organizations are starting to use containers, maturing from, virtual machines to moving to containerized workloads, things like that. And Kubernetes is the de facto container orchestration platform that there is out there. Many people use it to kind of orchestrate their container workloads in different cloud-native environments, and for good reason. It's great. It does what it does very well. It's very efficient, and it can increase development velocity, drive down timelines, cost optimization. The same things that we saw from open source software, for example. That said, there's a lot of security concerns with Kubernetes and containers as well. Palo Alto, for example, did some research through their Unit 42 threat research group. They found that 99% of Kubernetes Helm charts, which are essentially like kind of configuration files that you use to set up Kubernetes environments that were out in open repositories, for example, like Artifact Hub, had known insecure configurations, known vulnerabilities. And it's just like open source. People go, they use it. Hey, why would I write this from scratch? I can just go take something that's out there and use it. But it already has vulnerabilities baked in. Ed talked about the ability to automate, but if you have insecure configurations, misconfigurations, vulnerabilities embedded in these things, all you're doing is automating that at scale. That problem is now spreading much faster than it would have if you did it manually, if you slowed down and thought about what you were doing. Some recommendations around using Kubernetes and containers here, or won't read the whole list for you, but scanning these things, scanning your containers, scanning these manifest files for Kubernetes. And then starting to get them from a known trusted repository, or standing up internal repositories of hardened containers or known secure configurations for Kubernetes and so on. And then updating your incident response plans. I've worked with some organizations who have adopted these technologies, much like AI or much like you name it, the latest technology, the latest hype. But they haven't went back to things like incident response or business continuity, things like that, and updated those plans. If we have an incident with these technologies, how do we respond to it? Who do we call? Who has the expertise to actually resolve these things? Many organizations haven't done that, that work, that legwork to be prepared for when something happens, not if something happens. Another one I'm really passionate about is SaaS. We have all heard cloud security, and when you hear that, you think, oh, I need to secure AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle, you name it. But the problem is organizations are using, say, 2 to 4 IaaS providers, right, in most cases. Really mature, maybe they're using more than that. But they're using hundreds or even thousands of SaaS apps. I've worked with large organizations, both in the federal public sector and the commercial space, who are large enterprises, and they're using thousands of SaaS apps. And often, security or the IT team, for example, only control about 20% of that. Anyone can take a credit card. Any business unit that has purchasing power, just go spin up a new, Dropbox, you name it, whatever, Slack, the list goes on and on. There's tens of thousands of them. And most IT and security teams have no visibility of what these environments are, what proprietary or sensitive data is in there, whether it's intellectual property, PII, PHI, they have no clue. And not only that, but they take this warm blanket of compliance and say, oh, well, it has a SOC 2, it has a FedRAMP, it must be safe, right? No. Many of these incidents that are impacting SaaS providers, including, Some of the most well-resourced, capable SaaS providers in the world have those compliance artifacts, but they're still being compromised. So there's a lot of things you can do around, start to understand your SaaS consumption. I don't have it listed here, but I produced a report with Cloud Security Alliance, a SaaS security white paper around secure SaaS usage and governance that I definitely recommend checking out. It dives into like all these recommendations around this. Secure SaaS usage, but it includes things like just understanding what you're using, how it's being governed, and then starting to implement tools like SaaS Security Posture Management for folks who have heard of it. There's Cloud Security Posture Management. You can start to go out and scan SaaS environments now to see what are the configurations that are in place. What do I need to be concerned about? And the problem here is like it's not a scalable human problem. Like I've got, I think 10 certifications in AWS. I have many in Azure, et cetera. But there's thousands of SaaS apps. I can't be an expert in all of these SaaS apps. I need a tool and a technology to help empower me to mitigate the risks in these thousands of SaaS apps that I know more organizations using. And another key aspect of that is these SaaS providers are actually part of the software supply chain too. For example, Twilio had an incident that impacted 130 other companies because these SaaS apps are all talking to one another. They're integrated with your cloud environment, your on-premise environment. They're integrated with your identity access management systems. They may have access to sensitive data. Maybe you have very poor identity access management where you don't have federated identities between these SaaS providers and your organization. People get an account, they leave the organization, whether they leave willingly or unwillingly, they still have access. They still can share data from those environments. People haven't went back and cleaned those things up. They're not really governing this very well. And the challenging part is, I talked about Microsoft earlier, but the most capable, well-resourced, excellent organizations like Microsoft and Okta and on, they're even being compromised. So if it's impacting them, how do you think, how much less secure, for example, do you think a small bootstrapped SaaS startup is who's just trying to get to the market? They're feeling pressure from the venture community to get, customer traction and have return on investment. They don't have a robust, team of thousands of security engineers in securing their environment, for example. So you need to start thinking about SaaS as a part of the software supply chain, for example, as well. This is my session in this area where I want to talk about patching all the things. Everyone who's been in this space knows that vulnerability management is a thankless job. It's never-ending. It feels like a hamster wheel or a Sisyphean task of pushing a rock up a hill, and it just keeps coming and coming and coming. Most organizations right now, last year, I think it was, or 2022, I'm sorry, we saw over 20,000 known vulnerabilities, CVEs, that have been reported to NIST, National Vulnerability Database. And organizations simply can't keep up. And they can't patch all the things. There's some studies out there from an organization called Resilient, who showed that over 60% of organizations have a backlog of over 100,000 vulnerabilities. So they're obviously not keeping up. They're not able to keep pace with patching all the things. Some organizations have an average backlog of over 1 million vulnerabilities. And while you're going to address those, guess what? They keep coming and coming and coming. You can't burn that backlog down. And the Scientia Institute, who has some great studies and research, I definitely recommend checking them out. They've shown that organizations can only remediate 1 out of 10 new vulnerabilities in a given month. So say you're using hundreds or thousands of software providers, different apps, different open source projects and components. It's impossible. The number just keeps growing, and the capacity of your team to mitigate and remediate all these things is far excelled by the number of vulnerabilities that keep coming. Also, there's challenges of what do you patch? What do you prioritize? This one is an eye chart. You can't really see it too well. But of those 200,000 vulnerabilities, 20,000 of those in 2023, for example, we've seen over 15% year-over-year growth. And there's some nuance to that in the sense that are things less secure? Maybe, maybe not. We have more people looking. We have more security researchers, more people actually looking for vulnerabilities, which is a good thing. But we also have more software. It's powering everything of our society now. It's there's just simply more attack surface, more software, more applications, more vulnerabilities. And the challenge here is that of those 20,000, for example, this study here from Qualys, who's a vulnerability management company, showed that of those 20,000, 5% of those were ever actually exploited. So you're going out, you're prioritizing all your highs and your criticals, your severe vulnerabilities and things like that. But you're spending a lot of time patching things that malicious actors aren't even taking advantage of. They aren't compromising those. They pose no risk to you, essentially, at this point. You're focusing on things that aren't known to be exploited or are likely to be exploited, for example. So we're wasting tremendous time and effort. I talked about how security engineers are often outnumbered. We don't have enough. We hear all the time about the workforce challenges in security. If you're spending a lot of time, pushing this onto your development peers, especially in DevOps, where security should exist in a kind of, altruistic world, it often doesn't, or DevSecOps. If you're pushing these vulnerabilities and massive spreadsheets onto development teams, they're going to resent you. They're wasting time, it's slowing down their speed to the market, and they're not incentivized organizationally to prioritize this stuff because they're talking about feature backlogs and customer requests. This is not what they're concerned with, so you need to prioritize appropriately too. Luckily, there is some emerging vulnerability scoring and prioritization systems that I want to touch on here. The three I'm going to talk about is the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog. This is from our folks at CISA. It looks at known exploited vulnerabilities, so things that you can start to prioritize that have known exploitation underway against them. There's also the Exploit Prediction Scoring System. If you've heard of CVSS, EPSS is run by the same organization. It's just a different steering committee or working group of individuals, and I'm going to dive into that and show you why this one's so great in a moment. But here's the CISA CAV. It originally started in 2021 via a binding operational directive. Government loves our acronyms. But it got pushed out to federal agencies and said, here's these vulnerabilities that you need to remediate. You need to prioritize these above everything else. If it's on the CAV, you got to prioritize it. It recently hit 1,000. There's 1,000 known exploited vulnerabilities, and that's just what they know of. That's just what they're able to report. So if you have a vulnerability on this list, you must remediate it, and you must remediate above critical or high vulnerabilities, which makes sense because there's actual known exploitation against it, for example. But beyond that, there's other things, like I talked about EPSS. And this one, I'm not a physicist like Ed, and I don't have the mathematical background, but you can start to see the diagram of published vulnerabilities versus actual exploited vulnerabilities. And you're wasting a tremendous amount of time in the gray when you should be focused on the red. So what EPSS does is they have this machine learning approach. Daniel, maybe check it out. That's your area of expertise. But they have this machine learning approach that uses a lot of different avenues of telemetry and things that they get from industry sensors and other organizations who have products and things out there like that. And they start to produce a probability score of between a 0 and a 1 of how likely is this thing to be exploited in the next 30 days. And they've now went to start looking retroactively to see how accurate they are, and they're pretty damn accurate. So if you're looking at not only prioritizing known vulnerabilities, but likely to be exploited vulnerabilities, not only known exploitation, but likely to be exploited vulnerabilities, this is something you should be integrating as well. And this helps you look at things coming through the pipeline, for example, say maybe our risk tolerance is 0.6 on the EPSS scale. And you can go and tinker with that. I've helped organizations do this. There's different studies that show what should you set the EPSS threshold to focus on probabilistic exploitation. And that helps drive down a lot of the toil and the frustration on development and engineering peers because you're having them focus on things that actually are likely to be exploited, not just the thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of vulnerabilities every year that never get exploited. So we talk about DevSecOps and shifting security left. I heard Ed say that he's a purist in the sense that DevOps should always have included security. But the reality is it hasn't. Just because we want it to or we think it should doesn't mean it does. Hell, DevSecOps often doesn't include security in most organizations. They may say they're doing DevSecOps, but they're not really prioritizing vulnerabilities. They're worried about speed to market, burning down their feature backlog, meeting customer requests. And that starts at the top, and I'll get to that in a moment about secure by design, but we're often just throwing toil over the fence to development peers, and then they don't want to interact with us. We often get a reputation of being the office of no, if you've heard that phrase. And we've shifted left. We've shifted, SAST, DAST, infrastructure as code scanning, SCA. We shifted all the things. We did all the things right. But the problem is we're producing a lot of noise, not a lot of signal. And that noise is drowning our development engineering peers. So there's, things I talked about, like CISA-CAV starting to get traction, where you can focus on known exploitation. EPSS, looking at how probable is it that this is going to be exploited so I can prioritizing accordingly. There's also looking at exploitability. Is it actually reachable? Is this open source software component, for example, is it called at runtime? Is it a function that's actually used in the code? Can the malicious actors actually reach it? And you'll see that there's starting to come some security tools that can start to provide this reachability analysis of showing you of known vulnerable components in your ecosystem, which ones are actually reachable, which ones are actually exploitable. And then, of course, you need to look at things like business context and criticality. Is it a public-facing system that's critical to customer interactions and revenue generation, or is it some internal back office thing that just doesn't serve a critical function? That distinction is important too in terms of how you prioritize vulnerabilities within AppSec. So there's notable efforts underway. I talked about OpenSSF, the Linux Foundation. There's a lot of organization, OWASP. I've named many organizations who are putting out this information. The White House is even involved. In 2022, they held a big open source software security summit with these organizations, the Googles, the Microsofts, the industry agnostic organizations that you see here. And they produce goals around securing open source software production. CISA even produced their open source software roadmap, open source software security roadmap recently. They're starting to interact with the notable projects and notable contributors out there and try to lift the tide of the whole ecosystem. We're even seeing a push for secure by design. It's funny, I was talking to Rohit last night. He said they've been using this term for several years. And I went back, I don't have it here, but I went back to all the way to the Ware report, which is over 50 years old, and it was talked about building security in. So we're 50 years past that. We're still bolting security on. We're not building security in. And CIS is out there advocating for this approach. It talks about in the latest national cybersecurity strategy, for example, section 3 or 4, I think it is dedicated to this entirely. It talks about shifting that burden from customers, patch all the things, fix all the things, to the people producing the software. If I'm producing software, if I'm producing a product and putting it into the market, maybe I should take some more responsibility of what I'm putting out there and be held accountable for that versus just saying, hey, you gotta implement secure configurations. Hey, you gotta patch all the things. It's putting that onus on the people producing the software and putting it out into the ecosystem. So CISA has produced 2 iterations of their secure by design document out there. It includes a lot of different alerts and blogs as well on things like default passwords or SQL injection. Problems that we've been dealing with for decades that are still pervasive and still causing organizations to get compromised and have incidents that impact a massive amount of our society and citizens, for example. We have guidance galore, as I talked about, CNCF. I wrote the book on software supply chain I think it was a year ago at this point, and I cited all these. There was tens and tens of things from CNCF, OWASP, NIST, CISA, NSA around software supply chain security, AppSec, things like that, and the list is extensive. The problem that we have here is that we're best practices rich. There's all these best practices. We're just implementation poor. We're not doing the things. We know of all the things. We're talking about them. We're saying you should do all the things. We're just not doing the things. So this is my last slide here. And there's a couple books I wrote as I talked about software supply chain security, software transparency. That book is focused on that. I also have Effective Vulnerability Management that comes out in May from Wiley. I have an excellent co-author on that one from IBM. She has a PhD in human factors in cybersecurity. So we dive into not just the technology stuff that I talked about, but the human element of that that's often overlooked. We had, fun fact, we had Ron Gula write the foreword for that. Ron Gula is an industry legend like Ed, for example. So definitely, check it out if you're interested in vulnerability management. And then, as I talked about, just doing some of these fundamental things can have a huge impact on the ecosystem of understanding how we consume software, where we consume it from, what the vulnerabilities are, and then what do we need to actually focus on? How do we prioritize our limited, scarce resources accordingly? And maybe there's an opportunity for AI, for example, to help accelerate that and focus on the right things and accelerate remediation or accelerate producing secure code. I think we're all excited about the prospect of that. But I think that's still to come, in the near future. So there's some things you can do right now. And that said, that's the end of my talk, and up to Q&A, I think it is.
Thank you. Well, Chris has agreed to stay on and take some questions, so we'll get to that now. I have a couple I'll go to first from online, and then think about yourselves, guys, and we'll get a microphone over to you. But Chris, somebody asked a very specific question. I'm glad we were talking about XZ utils. I'm curious what you think this may mean for future threats for OSS.
Yeah, that one's a really tough one because if you look at it, it's not just like a technical thing. There was some social engineering, psychological, pressuring of the maintainer, for example, and it kind of highlights, how we rely on these open source software maintainers and contributors who are doing this on their own free will. As the maintainer mentioned in the interactions that we've seen come public now, this isn't his day job. He's just doing it on his own free time to give back to the community, to participate. And he faced pressures from either one or more threat actors, we don't know, but who are pressuring him to hey, you need to update this faster. You need to, remediate vulnerabilities or, address PRs faster, merge requests and so on. And he pointed out that this isn't my day job. And I think that's one thing that gets overlooked in the conversation of open source software security is, open source software maintainers and contributors, they're not suppliers in the traditional sense of software. They don't owe you anything. You have no contractual relationship with them. They don't have service level agreements. You can't make any demands of them of using secure software development practices and so on. They're doing this voluntarily, and I think it highlights the ecosystem relies on these people extensively, and maybe we need to start compensating them. Maybe we need to start looking at other metrics besides known vulnerabilities of how many people are contributing to this project, from where, how quickly do they remediate things, what is the hygiene of the posture of the repository where the software resides, and so on.
Good. No, thank you. Any questions in the group here? Just raise your hand if you do. We'll get a microphone. Oh, we have one right here. If we can get a microphone up front.
Nice talk, Chris. How do you recommend organizations use SBOM in a scalable manner across an enterprise security program?
Yeah, this one is, I might get myself in trouble with Dr. Alan Freeman of CISA, who I had the honor of collaborating with. He's like kind of Mr. SBOM. But I think that conceptually SBOM makes a lot of sense. Like, we know we need this transparency, this visibility, via these artifacts of what's in the software we're using, consuming. And there's been a lot of effort of like why you need an SBOM and the value of an SBOM, and how we can go about getting them or asking them from suppliers or integrating this into our cyber security supply chain risk management practices and so on. But we still have a long way to go in terms of ingestion, analysis, enrichment, reporting. So I think it's still TBD of how we do that at scale. But the thing we know is we can't continue on the path that we were on, which is kind of this buried in the head in the sand approach of just using it and having no visibility, no transparency of what's in it, no method of kind of communicating, saying, hey, are you going to fix this component in your product that has a known vulnerability? So a lot of that's being flushed out by the innovators, the people who are starting to use SBOMs now, and see like how can we use these artifacts, whether it's things like acquisition and procurement or incident response or vulnerability management. So I recommend starting down that path, using these artifacts, building competencies in it, looking for open source software and proprietary tooling, which there's a lot of vendors playing in this space. Like Ed talked about the VC community. There's a lot of software supply chain startups who focus on SBOMs, for example, playing with those tools and seeing how can we use this, how can we effectively make use of these artifacts to do what we're after, which is driving down organizational risk.
One more from online here, Chris. Someone says, currently think about implementation of AI ways to whitelist normality and simply blacklist the rest out. Your thoughts on that? Sounds easy.
Yeah, I almost want to defer to Daniel on this one because I'll be honest, this is outside of my area of expertise. But I can't tell you how, but I will say I have a lot of hope for AI to assist with these activities. Because it's simply untenable. We talked about like XZ, for example, for like us to go out and look at every open source software project, everything we consume from every contributor or maintainer across the whole internet, and make these risk-based decisions. We need an automated, scalable way to go about doing this. So I hope that AI can be part of that solution.
Yeah. Let me go back to the New York group here. Next question. We have one on the table right here. Yeah.
Hey, Chris, thanks for the great talk. My question is, usually when you go and build AppSec program with organizations, you can look on the current vulnerabilities and current supply chain issues, and you can also look of what can I do today to fix tomorrow. If you need to prioritize based off your vast experience, which road would you take first, and how would you manage that?
Yeah, you're pointing to like the dichotomy and challenge of like addressing the future to be state, but while looking at this massive, as I talked about, hundreds of thousands or millions of known vulnerabilities that we have in our backlog. And I know not everyone will agree with this, but like knowing that those are going to keep coming and coming and coming, and the approaches we're taking obviously aren't sufficient because the number of the backlog keeps growing and growing and growing, I would focus on the to be state. It's like I showed in the image there, if you're just emptying water from a sinking ship, good luck with that. Like, you need to address the whole. You need to address your practices of AppSec and vulnerability management from a mature perspective, rather than just continuing down the road of fixing what you can right now and acting tactically rather than strategically.
Yeah. There's a question here from the online group. Chris, do you expect that commercial software vendors will openly share the different types of open source and versions being used in their software? The government is mandating, but will this be available in non-government space?
Yeah, so actually, fun fact here is, in the OMB, Office of Management and Budget memos, 2318 and 2316, 2318, not to nerd out on you, but those are the memos that talk about this stuff. They actually backed off of requiring an SBOM as an artifact from software suppliers. Now they are requiring you to self-attest that we're using secure software development framework and that we understand what's in the software, but you're not having to provide an SBOM. It's not a requirement yet. You may have some federal buyers who request it from you and so on. And the challenge here, and the uncomfortable truth I think that we all need to address is like cybersecurity is a market failure. It's not going to address itself voluntarily. We have decades of proof to demonstrate that. Businesses are focused on revenue and profits and things like that. They're not just going to open up and show this level of transparency and do all the right things just for an altruistic purpose. There has to be some forcing function to do that. And the challenging part there is like, that's going to come in the form of regulation. And that could be better or worse. As Daniel talked about, in the European Union, for example, there's efforts to do some of these things, and they can have an ill-intended outpack of driving down economic growth, prosperity, even impacting national security when you're forced to use legacy technologies and processes, for example, because of regulation. So I don't think commercial companies will do this without being required to do it. And I think that, there is something to be said about at least forcing transparency. And let us make risk-informed decisions about the software we use and the things we put in our enterprise. At least show us what's in this. The idea that you can sell me something right now without even telling me what's in it is kind of ridiculous, in my opinion.
Yeah. Any questions in the room here? Okay, we'll go back to the online group. Someone named Alex is asking a very specific question. Chris, you generated some questions here. Can you mention an actual usage of EPSS to reduce or filter the vulnerabilities backlog?
Yeah, I'm working right now with a federal organization. I have, like I said, a consulting company. We have a platform as a service at one large federal organization, one of the largest in the federal executive branch. And we've taken EPSS and started using it in the pipeline to set a threshold for developers to say, hey, if it's below, I think it's 0.7 is what we tuned it to after some iterations. If it's below 0.7, you don't need to prioritize it, for example, on par with, say, SysACAV or EPSS scores of 7+. Or 0.7 plus, I should say. And that's been received very well because it's taken the vulnerability backlog and things that block deployment to production and introduce friction and resentment from developers. It's reduced that significantly. And it's not to say that you should never look at those things. It's just that you have limited time and resources. It's finite. So prioritizing what you can now, while still understanding like you have these other vulnerabilities you need to take a look at some point, but the challenge is you don't have enough time, enough resources to look at all of them all the time.
Yeah. The question here is the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, end of life? What's the future version of this resource?
So first off, despite being like a CISA fellow, I don't speak on behalf of CISA, I don't speak on behalf of NIST. I will say it's very concerning what's happened with the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, for folks who haven't been following it. In February, roughly, they stopped enriching vulnerabilities with things like CPE information. I think it's also like CWE and CVSS scores in some cases. They've only done a small subset of vulnerabilities since that date. You're talking like thousands of vulnerabilities that lack that information. So you have no way of understanding what products do these vulnerabilities belong to, what vendors are impacted, things like that. And they made some comments. The NIST representative made some comments at an event called VulnCon last month that I spoke at. And they said they're basically, they're aware of the issues. There were some contractual challenges. They plan to pull together a consortium of industry and NIST folks to try to address these deficiencies and challenges. But I think the industry itself is very, concerned about where this stands and like what the future of that looks like, given that right now we're kind of flying blind.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question here from someone named Rick. I know in my organization this isn't a thing, that's good, his organization, but Agile proposes T-shaped teams. What are Chris's thoughts on including one or more dedicated security experts on DevOps teams to focus on vulnerabilities in the backlogs?
I mean, this has to happen in my opinion. And I've seen some organizations do it well. But if you're, we talk about breaking down silos and building security in versus bolting it on, but if you don't have security on the ground working with the development team, the engineering team, all you're doing is acting as a gate after they do all that activity to be waiting to say, oh no, you can't deploy, you can't go to production. And it also produces other challenges, like security often isn't aware of the context or nuances of the system or application because they're working hand in hand with the development team. So you have to embed these folks in that project so that they can prioritize these things. Often what will happen is the development team will just put it in the backlog and it just builds and builds, and security technical debt kind of is like a force of gravity that just keeps growing. So you need security people on that team that understand the system context, and then they can even push back with assessors and auditors and so on and navigate that process with the development team rather than being an external entity. If the goal is breaking down silos, you do that by working together, not separated.
Yeah. Back to the room here, any questions before I go back online? Well, here's another one from this gentleman in the front. Just hang on till the microphone comes.
You mentioned that there is a lot of backlog in the NVD space right now. How much do you think has Linux CNA, the kernel CNA, has to contribute to that?
Yeah.
And what's your opinion about, kernel becoming the CNA and treating it a little bit like a dumpster?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not the foremost expert on this. I would definitely recommend looking at some research from a vulnerability researcher named Jerry Gamblin, who's with Cisco and was with Kenneth Security before that. But he's been highlighting the fact that like the Linux kernel team became a CNA and they have been, pumping CVEs into NVD earlier this year. I think some people on one hand have said like it's been better visibility. They're kind of cleaning up a backlog of known vulnerabilities and things like that, bringing more visibility and transparency. But I don't think it's overwhelmed NIST because it'd be one thing to say like NIST hasn't looked at the Linux kernel's entries, but they aren't looking at any of them. Like there's the majority of them have simply been neglected. Talking thousands or tens of thousands at this point, and it's because of the things they talked about at that conference where they spoke about the issues, which is like lack of funding. It's kind of crazy to me that like NVD, something that the whole world relies upon, including all the critical infrastructure, weapon systems, global organizations that produce software and consume software, is facing like funding challenges. Like if software is critical infrastructure, well then damn sure the system that reports all the vulnerabilities is critical infrastructure, and I'm sure we can come up with the funding somehow to support it properly.
There's a question here from a student named Haya. Can backlogs of vulnerabilities be tasked to entry levels or interns in cybersecurity, and the research teams be tasked with how AI can take on these challenges since resources can be scarce? He's a student looking for some work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great opportunity to like start looking at things and understand like, what the vulnerability is there a known exploit, is there a proof of code or proof of concept, but the challenge there is like, we've all been entry level, you don't know what you don't know. There's points in my career, like if you showed me a vulnerability, and still now, like in many cases, depending on the technology involved and so on, that I couldn't answer what this means exactly. But it is a great opportunity for them to get in there and start to do some analysis and understand like what the vulnerability is, what system it impacts, how it could potentially be exploited. So I think it's a great opportunity to leverage entry-level folks and get them familiar with it. And I think everyone should go through vulnerability management at some point in their career, because often what we're doing is advocating for more secure software, which is done by producing less vulnerabilities. So if you're not in that activity, it's really hard to understand how that works.
Yeah. Well, and this might relate to that. There's someone named Samantha is asking, would encouraging the improvement of people change management behaviors and developing processes contribute to making changes in patching efforts?
Yeah,
Does that make sense to you, Chris?
I think so. And I think I get where they're going. I talked about the book and like my co-author having a deep background in human factors. And she dives really deep into the people aspect of it. And the reality is like we don't consider like the cognitive overload or the mental capacity of the people doing these things. And another maybe potential opportunity for AI is like humans have emotions and life stressors, and they're not just these autonomous robots that can infinitely work forever remediating vulnerabilities and navigating backlogs and things like that. So you definitely need to look at the human element of this, in terms of how do we have these people interact in these processes, how can we improve them? Like Ed talked about, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. How can we have a better process to go about navigating these vulnerabilities, in my opinion?
Yeah, very good. I think we'll leave it there. I appreciate your time, Chris, and taking the questions as well. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.